All right, good evening. Thank you for spending some time. My name is Lou Diorio. I am a principal and owner of LDT Health Solutions. We are a quality management and medication safety consultancy and a healthcare quality company. Okay, I need to disclose that I am a shareholder of LDT, and the opinions expressed are that of mine, and the information that I'm going to present to you relative to the USP and the FDA are correct as of today. And for the latest compendial references, the websites are as you see them. These are our objectives. We're going to talk about the USP proposed compounding chapters. We're going to talk a bit about how the FDA is shaping that conversation as well. We want you to be able to speak conversantly about some of the possible changes, and those are there. So with that, I'd like to start, and I would like to first properly frame the conversation. The USP published some proposed changes to both the chapters on non-sterile compounding, that would be USP 795, as well as the sterile chapter, USP 797. However, these are not, I don't want to confuse anybody, these are not enforced, and these are not they're not in a form that can yet be dropped into the compendia. So these are proposed. So please remember that draft revisions are not considered official until they are published to be official. So on the slide, I have given you the current official chapters for non-sterile compounding, sterile compounding, hazardous drug handling, as well as the compounding of radiopharmaceuticals. So not to confuse anybody, the official chapters are what you should be following. What we're going to talk about today are the proposed changes. So the first thing is to be able to give you an opportunity to comment. Right now, as I said, the USP dropped these proposed chapters on us September 1st of 2021. The comment period for public comment will be open until January 31st, and they will accept comments up until that date. And on my timeline, I actually went out 6 months, and even if the USP decided to publish the next day, the earliest enforcement of official chapters would not happen before July 31st of next year. That is not my prediction. It is highly unlikely that will happen. I would, if I was a betting man or I had to take an educated guess, I would say we're probably looking at 2023 for any official lockdown of these two chapters. So with that, I'd like to jump over and talk about compliance. And when I talk about compliance in the context of these compounding, of the USP compounding chapters, it is always interesting to really see what the FDA is doing in the field and how they are shaping the conversation. And this matters because of all of the overlapping regulation and all of the agencies that could possibly come visit you, regardless of your what sort of compounding establishment that you're running, whether it's a hospital, a health system, a community practice, a home care company, a 503B outsourcing provider. Any one of these agencies could come in and talk to you about any one of the USP chapters that are on the screen. What I think is important for some of you out there, especially those of you involved in billing any of the CMS programs, so that would be Medicare and state Medicaid, CMS has published no less than 3 documents reinforcing the fact that anything short of full compliance with all of the official USP chapters for compounding would violate your conditions of participation and therefore make you ineligible to bill the programs. We have had instances where conditions of noncompliance were identified, and that triggered a full-blown CMS audit for several of our health system clients. So it's not something that you want to ever get involved in. So in the conversation about how the FDA is shaping what's going on at the USP, it's important to remember that some of the confusion that's created in the field is simply because the FDA uses a quite different reference point than we as pharmacists are used to. So the FDA will come in and they will, regardless of your establishment designation, they will come in and they will survey to GMP. They will survey to 21 CFR. So when they do that, you need to understand that the conversation, contrary to being a pharmacy conversation, it will be a conversation based in product-focused production. Now, FDA is product-focused, not in real time, right? So if you think about it, there's nobody waiting at the front gates of Pfizer for the next lot of Viagra to roll out of the production plant. At least I hope not. When we talk about pharmacy practice, the contrast is that our practice and our focus is patient-centric. The provision of our care is in real time, and it's driven by BOP regulations. Whereas on the GMP side, it's product-focused. How does what you do impact the product? Pharmacists are geared and trained and think primarily in a frame of reference of how is it going to impact the patient. So it's this inherent disconnect that creates the confusion at the jumping off point. Now, what you see on the screen is an extraction from our LDT's proprietary database of inspectionary documents from the FDA. We maintain the largest private database of FDA inspectionary documents outside of the FDA itself. And the point there is that this is what the FDA is surveying to. What you see on the screen, all of those 25 bullets are actually language right out of the CFR. As of September of 2021, you can see that the FDA obviously has bandwidth. This is where they're operating. They're operating currently in 46 states, and they have visited both Alaska and Hawaii. So for those of you in the extremes of the union, you can get visited. Now, in that experience, these are the top 5 citations for 503A compounders. And I'll take a minute to sort of decode the FDA speak here. When you see the phrase aseptic compounding, aseptic processing areas, those are your compounding areas, those are your clean rooms, those are your SCAs. And so the FDA has been focusing most recently on how we monitor our environmental conditions, how we deal with deficient conditions regarding cleaning and disinfection of the rooms. When the FDA uses the term clothing, they are not talking about street clothing. They are either referring to garb, the gowning, gloving, and garbing that we do, or in the context of HD or what the FDA terms highly potent drugs, it is PPE. So they're finding deficiencies in garbing and PPE. They're also finding deficiencies in contamination, and they immediately point that to conditions of adulteration and non-sterility. So that starts to lead you down the road of recall and other action by the agency. So that's the 503A side. This is an interesting document from the Joint Commission, and this gets back to my earlier point. The Hospital Accreditation Program, or the HAP document, the Joint Commission uses this, and this is a very direct and simple crosswalk between the Joint Commission standard, which is basically driven by pharmacy practice, best demonstrated practice. It crosswalks it to directly to the Joint Commission standards from the USP, and then points you directly to the CMS condition of participation that you have violated. So this is an immediate trigger for the conversation about your CMS status. So something interesting, if you have never seen that document, you should go to the Joint Commission website and download it. It's a free PDF. When we're speaking about 503Bs, the landscape there, the regulatory landscape there is somewhat different. When you do voluntary registration as a 503B, obviously you put yourself on the stage immediately with the FDA. However, what we're finding in the field is additionally, because of licensure requirements, there are states that have seen the ability to charge a fee for 503Bs operating within their borders as a revenue stream. So we have several states that require that you register with them as well. And also there are states similarly to states requiring out-of-state pharmacy licenses to be able to operate a mail order or a specialty distribution sort of business. They are also requiring state licensure. States like California, Florida, New York, all require this additional licensing. There also may be requirements relative to having a pharmacist in charge with a personal license in that state. So it's getting more and more complex. It's getting more and more convoluted. Some state boards will not get into this sort of conversation. However, they've abdicated that to their State Department of Health. So it could be quite confusing. So depending on, for those of you that are purchasing for 503Bs, it gets a little confusing as to what their exact licensure should be, as well as if you are planning or you're trying to fact find to see if you would want to operate a 503B, you need to run through this entire regulatory gauntlet to be able to tell where you need to be. This was provided by our good friends at Pharmacy Purchasing and Products. And this was just a representation of what the marketplace looks like for 503Bs. And the other reason I embedded this in the presentation is I think in this conversation, and whether we're talking about 503A, the status of 503B practice, or where the USP is in their proposed publication process, this is a good resource. You can get yourself a free subscription, either print, electronic, or both, at pppmag.com. So you should avail yourselves of those. Now, these are the citations, slightly different, again, from our database. This is an extraction for the same time period, and you can see that these citations are different. Now, what they're looking for in a 503B is actually kind of curious. Environmental monitoring is still in the conversation. Non-compliance to their own policy and procedure is been front and center. Deficiencies in labeling, which is a mystery to me, because in the entire text of the Drug Quality and Security Act that established 503B practice, that's one of the few sections where I would say it's pretty straightforward. They give you a list. This is the stuff you need on your label. And for whatever reason, 50% of the time when the FDA visits, a 503B is dinged because they don't have a proper label. So probably the most curious one to us and the most upsetting one to me as a quality person is the failure to thoroughly review any unexplained discrepancies. And the FDA goes on to specify, even though the batch has not been distributed, there is this very, very troubling pattern where a 503B would produce a batch, the batch would fail their specification, whether that's sterility, potency, whatever, and they would simply scrap the batch and figure no harm, no foul, it never got to patients. However, the FDA is saying, hold on, as a 503B, we want you to take the product-focused attitude, and you need to run those aground, even though they were not distributed, because there are lessons to be learned there, and that's not happening. So it's very curious. Another way the agency is shaping the conversation beyond direct inspection is the issuance of regulatory guidance. And since July of 2014, the agency has issued at least 28 policy statements or guidance documents impacting both compounding and pharmacy practice. And so I have lined out the sort of general topics that the FDA has focused on. And the first one is in sanitary conditions, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But for those of you in hospital practice, we have a hospital and health system CPG or guidance document. For those of you that are curious about repacking biologics, we have a document for that. If you're compounding, you need to familiarize yourselves with these documents. They're all posted to the FDA website. However, their applicability to your practice is what I'd like to speak about next. And basically, this is a quote from the front page of the unsanitary conditions guidance. These guidances, and what you need to focus on is these guidances really don't establish legally enforceable responsibilities. They generally describe the agency's current thinking on a topic. Now, for those of you like myself that look at these documents on a pretty regular basis, they go through patterns. There is a draft published, then there's an interim guidance published, and then they finally, at some point, will publish what they call a final guidance. However, not too much final about it, because the FDA can pull that guidance document at any time if their thinking changes and publish something else. So it's just a sort of a signpost that you need to be aware of. And unless what the FDA is telling you in that guidance document is backed by a specific regulation, it is nothing more than that. It is the thinking of the agency, and it is a guidance, not a regulation. So the problem, however, is that the FDA will inevitably come into your establishment and write the 483s that we talked about earlier from the perspective of violations of these guidance documents. So that's where the conversation gets incredibly complicated and incredibly confusing. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal. It appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in 2019. And for those of you who don't remember 2019, that was pre-pandemic. Bradshaw and Malik did a great job, and the title of this article always amazed me. The Twisted Case of the Deceptive Pretzels really is about how FDA guidance letters fed frivolous lawsuits on the food side of the industry, and actually there were some less than scrupulous attorneys that benefited to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars here by using a guidance document not based on regulation to proceed with a court case. The boxed section in the last column there really describes the true legal process. There is a process for the agency if they wish to change a regulation, if they wish to impose new law. There is an established pathway that would include public comment and publish of those proposed regs and those final regs in the Federal Register. And for undisclosed reasons, I mean, we could speculate, but for undisclosed reasons, they choose not to avail themselves of that legal process. And the FDA currently is choosing to regulate from the shadows, regulate from these guidance documents. And that is the crux of the article. So it's a very interesting and very dangerous sort of path that the FDA has taken. But I would say if you looked at the FDA's record over the last decade, they haven't been overly successful in court. So I can understand their trepidation to go in and try to litigate some of these instances. So this is the guidance document that I foretold earlier. This is the unsanitary conditions guidance. If you are operating a pharmacy, even if you are not compounding, you need to download this document and read this document. And this was actually from a pharmacist perspective, this was actually a brilliant strategy by the FDA, because regardless of your state board's attitude towards embracing or not embracing USP chapters or embracing or not embracing FDA guidance, the fact of the matter is that every practice act for every pharmacy, for every state, every practice act contains language, and not in the compounding section, but in the general section about what constitutes a pharmacy, there is language to this effect. You will maintain your pharmacy in a neat, orderly, and sanitary way. The FDA latched onto that and said, well, we're going to talk about insanitary conditions, and whether we're talking about compounding or not, these conditions could trigger further action, because if your pharmacy is being operated in an insanitary way, and for those of you who think that's a typo, the FDA did not use unsanitary, because the difference between the word unsanitary and insanitary is the inference in the word that the condition of filth render injurious to health in the definition of the word insanitary includes the possibility of death, not just the possibility of sickness or injury, as it does in unsanitary. So the FDA is purposefully using this kind of language to sort of set the tone before they even do their inspection. So the first general condition is something that we can all agree on: insects, rodents, and other pests. And then they go on from there. Where it gets really dangerous is the FDA's broad application of this document, because it doesn't have to apply to the area, the direct area where you're compounding either your non-sterile or your sterile preparations. Your drugs don't even need to be contaminated to qualify. If you look at statements that the FDA has made, this guidance is intended to assist boards of pharmacy and other agencies in implicating or making the inference that somehow the drugs that are kept in your pharmacy are somehow misbranded or adulterated or contaminated under the meaning of the act. So any one of these 54 areas that are mentioned in the guidance document, beyond rodents, there's the presence of deterioration of your compounding areas, the presence of rust and things like that, disrepair, areas of dirt that are not addressed. It will all trigger regulatory action. So, best to look through that and really prepare yourself and make sure that none of those 54 areas apply to you. Now, with that, I will finally get to really the point of the presentation here, and that's to talk about the proposed changes to the chapter. So immediately, you should assess in your heads where you are with compounding of preparations, right? Do you engage in non-sterile compounding? Do you engage in sterile compounding? And does that sterile or non-sterile compounding contain any hazardous medications as defined by NIOSH or OSHA? And therefore, if that, depending on where you land on this continuum, those are the chapters. It'll be some blend of 797 sterile, 795 non-sterile, and USP 800, the handling of hazardous drugs. So it'll be somewhere in that continuum. So how do you begin to get your arms around a compliance plan? I prefer to think of it, or the easiest way to think of it is to break it down into what I like to call the 3 Ps, right? People, places, and practices. And what I mean there is, when we talk about people and we talk about USP compliance, we're really talking about training. When we talk about places, we're talking about the environment and maintaining and cleaning the environment, and environmental monitoring of the control spaces, and the spaces where you're storing drug for human use. And as far as the term practices, that really speaks to formalized policy and procedure and all the requisite documents that go along with that. So I'd like to begin. We'll begin with non-sterile compounding. So in non-sterile compounding, the changes here, and all of these chapters in the proposed are available at usp.org. There is a bibliography slide at the end, so you can find these websites, but it eliminates the categories of compounding. So for those of you that are familiar with that, complex, not complex, all of that, simple or all of that goes away. And there's they are trying to homogenize and blend the terminology and the language used across 795, 797, as well as 800. So you'll see a lot of the terminology and a lot of the language being sort of blended. So that's an interesting sort of trend. There's expanded guidance for BUDs for non-sterile preps. They did remove the link between the establishment of BUDs that existed between 795 and 797 in the current chapters. All of that is eliminated. And there was a elaboration of the role of water in determining BUDs in non-sterile preps. And quite frankly, most pharmacists are using the wrong water to do their compounding, because most pharmacists are not aware that they need to refer to USP chapter 1231, water for pharmaceutical purposes, and there are several decision trees in there to choose the correct water for the dosage form that you are compounding. So if you think that the only two answers are tap water and steam distilled water, you need to go back and look at those chapters, because you're probably using the wrong water to do what you're doing. There's a clarification and an elaboration in the chapter about recall procedures for non-steriles, and obviously you need to look at that. I believe there's a lot of overlap there between the expectations of your average state board. I think we are in a universe where things happen, life is complicated, and everything we do needs to be trackable, traceable, and certainly recallable. So you need to take a look at that. The following practices have been excluded from the chapter and moved to other places or made exceptions or moved outside the chapter. So administration, and things that are all of the USP chapters refer to pre-administration activities. So anything that begins with administration then becomes outside the chapter. So you can certainly create a non-sterile capsule based on a patient-specific order from a licensed prescriber. The minute that is dispensed to a patient, that's the administration phase, it's outside the chapter. Radiopharmaceuticals, both sterile and non-sterile, have been moved to USP 825 and therefore reside there. Reconstitution in the context of the package insert. So when you reconstitute an antibiotic suspension from a manufacturer, if you're doing it according to the approved label and labeling, it is outside the chapter. Repacking and repackaging have been moved to USP 1178 and are no longer directly part of the chapter. And splitting of tablets has been taken out and moved. So just to clarify, one of the other things that was done was the list of medicines intended to be sterile now includes nasal and sinus preps for local applications. So nasal sprays, nasal irrigations are now have been removed from 797 and have been moved to 795. So that was an interesting development. And again, these practices are not subject to the chapter, and you can certainly go to those other USP chapters for clarification and further information. One of the other changes in the chapter was the clarification and the formalization of cleaning. And again, this is sort of to bring the chapter in line with the with this sort of format that they developed in 797. That is what's going on here. So it is work surfaces, floors, walls, ceilings, and storage shelving. There is a clarification there. I guess a lot of non-sterile operations actually were deficient in the fact that they didn't have a specific cleaning protocol for some of these non-direct surfaces. And that the chart that you see on the screen is from table 1 of the proposed chapter. All right, moving on, we're going to move into the sterile compounding section, USP 797. So again, when we look at what preps we're talking about, and again, just to remind you, 797 is all about the pre-administration activities. So once a dose is injected into a patient or a bag is hung on an IV pole and hooked to a patient, 797 ceases to exist. But before then, we have a lot of work to do, so let's talk about that. Irrigations for the mouth, rectum, or sinus cavities are no longer required to be sterile, so they were removed from the chapter. The major revisions here include a change in the definition of compounding, and this is very key here because what the USP chapter did, or the USP committee did, was embed into the chapter the definition of compounding that aligns with language that the FDA has used for years. So there's this alignment with the FDA and sort of an abandonment of the USP being cutting their own path here. There's the creation of 3 categories, designated as category 1, 2, and 3, and an abandonment of the low, medium, and high categories. So take that for what it's worth. Low, medium, high, 1, 2, 3, small, medium, and large. It's 3 categories, okay? There were changes in the immediate use CSP category. So if you look through there, we currently have a 1-hour window from prep to administration to a patient. That has been widened to a 4-hour window. So there was a sort of a loosening up there. There were changes in personnel qualifications. So the training and the media qual sections, as well as the documentation that goes with that, has been changed. And you need to look through there. There was a cap on the maximum batch size of CSPs that require sterility testing. So you are now capped. If this goes through unchanged, you will be capped at a maximum batch size of finished doses of 250 final units. So whether that's syringes or single dose vials or mini bags, 250 is the max batch size. PEC changes, there were, primary engineering controls, there were changes in terminologies. What we would consider a glove box or an isolator is now referred to as a restricted access barrier device. Isolators no longer the term isolators only applies to closed devices that have their own decontamination apparatus. So isolators, pharmaceutical isolators have been lined out and have been further defined. So what you have today as an isolator is probably going to end up being a RAB, and how you use it is going to change. There was an expansion and a sort of tip of the hat to automation, and there is language in the chapter about robotic enclosures. There were requirement changes in secondary engineering controls, so the rooms and the buffer rooms that we use, and we'll talk about that when we go into the definitions of the individual categories. There was an expansion of the role of segregated compounding areas. So today, technically, you cannot use a segregated compounding area for the production of hazardous drugs, but they corrected that in this revision, and you will be able to use, if the BUDs that are allowed with a segregated compounding area work in your practice setting, you'll be able to use or set up a segregated compounding area for either a hazardous application or a non-hazardous application. There are changes. There's a decrease in the intervals for viable air and surface monitoring. They're more frequent. Changes in BUD determinations and the data that we collect, the testing that we do has moved in this revision. They are pointing to USP stability indicating method only. No longer will time point studies be allowed. And there was a refinement in the role of quality assurance versus quality control. So when the USP committee refers to quality assurance, they're talking about the program, the system of KPIs, key performance indicators that you're using, whereas quality control refers to the data and the information that is a result of the QA program. So for most of you and for myself, I know that I, for years and years, use these terms interchangeably. We're going to have to tighten up our language, and we're certainly going to have to pay attention when we read documents, because these terms are now have two totally different meanings. Okay, there were changes in the chapter relative to cleaning and disinfecting requirements and the processes that we conduct, how we conduct cleaning and disinfection, and we'll delve into that in a moment. There is changes in compounding documentation, most notably the requirement for a master formula document and a batch record when you compound to align with current thinking about control process and how we are able to control the quality or assure the quality of what we're doing for our patients. Okay, so the chapter now includes these specific practices and they're defined. Repackaging, allergen extracts has been moved to its own section, and blood or other biological material like analogous blood compounding, there is a section inside the chapter. However, I caution everyone that the analogous blood section is obviously depends on the local jurisdiction and if that is allowed by your State Board of Pharmacy. So be very careful. This is not a green light to establish analogous blood compounding programs. This is simply an expansion of the chapter to speak to those areas of practice if your Board of Pharmacy allows them. It now redefined administration and preparation per approved labeling. So if you are inside the approved labeling, the package insert, and you're making a single dose and you meet other conditions, you may not be compounding. So you may be in an immediate use or an administration situation. So those are interesting. That may allow some practice settings to shift some of the compounding to bedside. So we'll see how that shakes out. It revises the provisions for immediate use. So it's no longer 3 individual packages. It is now no more than 3 different sterile products. And they the language sort of moved away from 3 packages to 3 different sterile products. And administration must begin within 4 hours, and it was previously an hour. So there is a widening there of what immediate use means. Okay, and I talked about this earlier. They replaced high, medium, and low with categories 1, 2, and 3, and there is that specific carve out for radio pharmacy. This is a representation from the chapter of the cleaning of classified areas and segregated compounding areas. I want you to look to the right. There is a definite schedule of the application of sporicidal agents, and now it is no longer up to the pharmacy to use their environmental monitoring to be able to flex that. It is on a definite schedule, so that should be examined by you all. Changes in personnel qualifications and the training, hand hygiene and garbing, regardless of the category that you're doing, remains upon hire, orientation, and then annually thereafter. And then based on the categories that you are engaged in, whether 1 and 2 will go to every 6 months from a year, basically now, if you equate low and medium to categories 1 and 2, for argument's sake. And then if you are in category 3, the highest level of risk here, it is quarterly. So something to think about. So the question is it compounding or is it immediate use? So it is not compounding if you are mixing, reconstituting, or performing other such acts that are performed in accordance with the directions contained in the approved labeling, and any other manufacturer directions consistent or included in that labeling. So basically, you're outside of USP 797 if it's prepared as a single dose, if it's intended for a single patient, and if the resulting following of all the labeling and packaging that comes with the dose is the resultant strength, container closure system, and storage time is all specified in that package insert, then you are not compounding. So that is something to think about, especially in larger institutions, or for those of you that are trying to offload some volume to bedside. Again, not going to make a comment about the quality or safety of those practices. I'm just telling you that it will be, for the purposes of the regulation, excluded. So Lou, what is all this about category 1, 2, and 3? So basically, category 1 is a primary engineering control inside a segregated compounding area, which is what you see in the photo. It's just a laminar flow hood sitting in a room that's out of general traffic. The room contains no windows to the outside world that can open, and there you are. That is that would be considered an SCA, or it could be in a buffer room, or a containment buffer room. So this applies to both positive and negative air conditions, but it is a device inside of a non-ISO classed room. And the BUDs there would be 12 hours or less room temp, 24 hours or less when refrigerated. And only if you follow all of the requirements for category 1 in the chapter. So there is a bunch of stuff about training. There's the garbing and the hand washing and the other requirements in there. So anything that applies to category 1, you need to follow. The good news is that the BUDs are what they are on the screen, and that there is no requirement for sterility or endotoxin testing if you stay in that BUD window that's on the screen. For category 2, the easiest way, and this is not exactly true, but the easiest way to think about it, because there is one exception to this rule, the easiest way to think about it is the road to category 2 almost always goes through an anteroom. There's one, and I'll describe it at the end, there is one exception to that. But generally, without an anteroom, you will never get to category 2. The BUDs, if you do have an anteroom that opens into either an anteroom of ISO 8 or ISO 7 that opens into an ISO 7 buffer room that contains an ISO 5 primary engineering control, you can have 12 hours at room temperature or 24 hours when refrigerated. There is some requirement for sterility or endotoxin testing based on the BUD you wish to assign this prep, and that is contained in Table 11, which I'll show you in a moment. And if the assumption here is only if you're following all the applicable requirements in the new chapter that describe category 2. So with that, I will tell you the one exception. The one exception is that you can get to category 2 if you use a true pharmaceutical isolator, which is not the glove boxes that we own today. If you happen to purchase or are in possession of a true pharmaceutical isolator, you can get to category 2 without an anteroom, but that is a very narrow window, and I would make sure that your isolator qualifies. Here is Table 11 from the proposed chapter. So basically, if you're reading this, aseptically processed CSPs, so that means CSPs made from commercially available sterile product, you will be able to get, and you do not choose to perform a sterility test from only sterile starting components, you will be able to get 4 days of BUD at room temp, 10 days in the refrigerator, and if you choose to freeze it, you can still get the 45 you can get today, but basically your BUDs are 4 days room temp, 10 days refrigerated. And then the maximums that you can get if you choose to sterility test obviously go up 30 days, 45 days from the 4 and 10. And then if you terminally sterilize what you're making, you can get up to the 90-day, the 60-day, 90-day window there if you terminally sterilize and you perform a sterility test. So you really need to look at your practice. You really need to look at what sort of BUDs you need to achieve, and then sort of make your way through this minefield to figure out how to change your process and how to change your master formula documents. And at the end of the road, we're finally going to talk about category 3. So category 3 starts with an ISO-classed cleanroom suite, including an ante. You must have an ante to get to category 3. You must then comply with all of category 2. And then if that doesn't wear you out, you need to add full sterile garb, so total skin coverage. No exposure of the forehead, the back of the neck, or the area around the eyes. So that means full bunny suit, which is not required in category 2. The use of sporicidal disinfectant agents goes up. It's mentioned, and it's part of the chapter now for all categories, but it goes up. There is an increased frequency of environmental monitoring that includes weekly activities. So it's not monthly, it is weekly. And all stability determinations, as I said earlier, will be driven by the USP stability indicating methods. So you will not be able to extrapolate time point data that you have now. And everything must undergo a USP 71 sterility test. Now, there is some interesting caveats in there. They do leave the window open for equivalent technologies for sterility testing. So for those of you that have been asking about, or those of you who have been contemplating the use of so-called rapid scan testing, it does allow it in the language of this proposed chapter if the provider of the equipment or the provider of the service who's using the rapid scan can give you documentation that it is equivalent to USP 71. And then if endotoxin testing is required, you must then also conduct 85. So why would you go through all of this? Because these are the maximum BUDs. If you aseptically process and pass all applicable tests for category 3, then you can bring your storage conditions into line with this, which is 60 days at room temp, 90 days in the refrigerator. Or if you terminally sterilize and then run a sterility test and pass all the other applicable tests for category 3, you can get the BUD up to 90 days at control room temp and 120 days in the refrigerator. But remember, again, this is with a maximum usable batch size of 250. So there is a yin and a yang to all of this. So in conclusion, or in summary, full compliance to what is proposed in the USP compounding chapters will require a multi-pronged, multidisciplinary approach. Considerations to both FDA guidance, Controlled Environmental Testing Association standards, which are mentioned in the USP chapters, and local Board of Pharmacy regulation will be necessary to assure that your compliance program is holistic and that all gaps have been eliminated. And remember that, remembering for all of us, let's focus on the fact that patient safety is our primary objective. So with that, I will thank you for your time and attention. Any questions or any comments can be directed to my email, which is there on the screen. And I want to thank PharmaSalon for the opportunity to spare and share some time with you. Thanks a lot.
Lou, thank you very much. As always, great information. My understanding is that there's been a battle on the changes of USP for a long time. I was told even 10 years. So my question is, were there some concessions that the USP people made to what no? So they just did what they thought was necessary. Okay.
That's gonna get me in a bunch of trouble. But on its face, no. So just for the folks that sort of got out of pharmacy school yesterday, or the folks that are curious about this, first of all, you need to know that any comment sent to the USP during a proposed or one of those proposed draft periods has to be answered. So if they send in a question, big or small, they need to address every question that is submitted by the public. So as far as the protraction of time between the 2004 release, the 2008 releases, which is what we're dealing with now, and the 2019 proposed release, what you're referring to is the lawsuits, and there were 3 of them that came up between 2019 and now. So what they did was, 3 groups, lawyered up and said, hold the phone here. You're dropping all these BUDs. We want to present some additional scientific data to sort of mitigate that, because quite frankly, some of, if I wasn't a trusting type, I would tell you that some of the detail that's buried in any one of these chapters at times is capricious and arbitrary, right? So, and even even members of the present and the past expert committees for USP, especially 797, have admitted publicly that some of, especially some of the BUDs in what we commonly refer to as the matrix, the chart of BUDs, were swag, were guesses. So what they did do was, because of the lawsuits and the conversation that came around asking for hard data, show me the money sort of position, they not only released, each chapter not only comes with the proposed chapter itself, it comes with a rationale document, and it also comes with a BUD document. But as far as the actual chart and matrix itself, there wasn't a widening of those BUDs. There was a narrowing of those BUDs, except when you're talking about getting to category 3. But at the same time, and this is just one pharmacist opinion, they did manipulate the universe in several ways with the help of FDA. And there are several USP members, several FDA employees on the expert committee. By capping the batch size at 250, that changes the conversation, because just from just a basic math point of view, this testing, then you lock in the sort of the ROI calculation of, how much is a dose cost and how much, testing, and you load all those things in. Once you lock in that 250 dose limit, all of the costs and all of the, I know we're not supposed to think in terms of business. We're not supposed to think in terms of dollars and cents when we're talking about patient safety. But if it's not practical, I think what we're going to see in the marketplace is an exiting of independent compounders. Certainly, I think what we're going to see on the health system side is a consolidation. I think if this goes through unchanged, the implications on healthcare practice is going to be that the USP committee and the FDA are going to undo about 30 years of health system decentralization, like trying to get closer to the patient to provide services. What you're going to see is you're not going to see compounding going on in the emergency room and the operating room and the L&D suite and the colonoscopy suite. You're going to see hospitals just to consolidate costs are going to be forced to go back to a centralized model, and that's really going to affect access to patients in a healthcare situation. So yeah, this is I would encourage everybody who listens to this and everybody who is going to participate in the Pharma Salon, the Grand Salon, really, there's several electronic ways that you can submit comments, please.
So thank you very much. We will be available for after the panel discussion on surviving USP and FDA challenges, adapting to overcome changes, which is October 8th at 4:00 Eastern Standard Time. All right. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend.